Hello, everyone. Have a nice day. Have you ever imagined what the moment would feel like when Diep finally returns to school? Today, we'll follow Diep as she takes that brave step with James beside her, calm and steady, helping her turn fear into relief. And we'll also linger on the happiest moments after. Warm roasted sweet potatoes, milk tea, soft laughter, and that quiet feeling of maybe the future is possible again. If you find it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. She almost dropped the pen, not because her hand was weak, because the moment was louder than the room. The registration counter was nothing special. Chipped laminate, a stack of forms, a tired fan pushing warm air in slow circles. A clerk glanced up, bored, ready to move on to the next number. Around them, life stayed ordinary footsteps, murmured questions, the squeak of plastic chairs. But to Diep, the line on that paper looked like a cliff. Her name, her future, her quiet dreams standing there exposed under fluorescent light. Diep's breath caught. The pen hovered, trembling just above the blank. Her fingers turned cold. For a second, she could hear only her own heartbeat, too fast, too sharp, like it was trying to warn her away. James didn't say a word. He was beside her, close enough to feel without crowding. His hand rested on the edge of the counter, not touching her, just there. Calm, steady, an anchor that didn't demand anything. Diep stared at the line again, blinking hard. If she cried now, she'd feel ridiculous. If she froze, she'd feel worse. She swallowed, forcing air into her lungs, and then, with one careful motion, she signed. Ink met paper. It didn't sparkle. It didn't explode into fireworks. It simply happened. And the warmth that spread through her chest wasn't exciting. It was relief, like she'd been holding her breath for years, and someone finally reminded her she was allowed to breathe. James leaned in slightly, voice low, soft enough that the room couldn't steal it. "You did it." Diep nodded once, eyes shining. "I really did." Morning had started in the bamboo house like nothing important was supposed to happen. Sunlight slipped through the woven walls and painted the floor in pale gold. The air still carried a faint scent of dry bamboo and last night's firewood. Outside, the countryside woke up slowly, leaves brushing in the wind. A distant rooster, the kind of quiet that made you hear your own thoughts too clearly. Diep sat cross-legged by the low wooden table with a thin folder in her lap. She didn't open it right away. James leaned against a bamboo pillar, watching her with the patience of someone who'd learned what pressure could do. His gaze didn't push, it waited. Nye wasn't home. The night before, Diep had sent her to stay with a trusted acquaintance, someone kind and discreet, someone James trusted. Not because danger was coming, because Diep needed one day to focus without fear snapping at her ankles. One day where she could try to be brave without also trying to be everything at once. Still, her hands trembled when she finally opened the folder. Photocopied documents, an old student photo, a folded piece of paper worn soft at the edges. She unfolded it slowly and stared at her own handwriting, uneven, shy, stubborn in a way her past self hadn't even understood. One day, I'll go back. Her smile appeared before she could stop it. Then her eyes turned wet, as if her body didn't trust happiness without payment. James noticed immediately. He crossed the room and crouched beside the table, forearms resting loosely on his knees. "Still want to?" he asked gently. Diep nodded, throat tight. "I do. I'm just scared I forgot how." James's mouth curved, quiet and sure. "Then we'll remember together." He reached into his bag and set things on the table. Extra copies, a pen, a transparent folder neatly prepared, like he'd been carrying hope around for her, even when she couldn't carry it herself. Diep looked up, startled. "You prepared all this already?" He shrugged like it was nothing, like it was obvious. "I was hoping you'd ask." Her chest tightened in a way that almost hurt. "What if I'm too late?" James met her gaze steady, calm, unafraid of her fear. "You're not late. You're arriving." The words settled over her like a blanket drawn up against cold shoulders. After a simple breakfast, Diep stood in front of the small mirror on the bamboo wall. She wore a clean white blouse, plain, comfortable, nothing dramatic. Yet it felt like a costume she hadn't dared to put on in a long time. She tied her hair low, hesitated, then let a few strands fall naturally, trying to look like someone who belonged in the world again. James stood behind her. When she turned, he paused just one beat too long. "What?" Diep asked, suddenly self-conscious. He stepped closer and adjusted her collar with careful fingers, his touch light and respectful, like he didn't want to startle something fragile back into hiding. "You look like yourself," he said. "That's all." Diep exhaled, shoulders loosening. "I want to feel normal again." James nodded. "Then today's a good start." The ride into town was peaceful, a narrow road lined with green fields, small houses opening their gates, morning smoke lifting from kitchens. Diep held on to James on the motorbike, not desperate, not clinging just enough to feel steady. Students passed on bicycles, backpacks bouncing. For once, she didn't feel separated from them. She felt close to their world, like the distance wasn't permanent, like it could be crossed. At the registration building, Diep slowed her steps. James didn't rush her. He simply stayed beside her, close enough that she could lean if she needed. "We take it step by step," he said. "No pressure." Inside, it was ordinary numbers being called, papers sliding across counters, bored voices repeating the same questions. Nothing dramatic, just life moving forward. They sat on a bench. Diep clasped her hands, breathing carefully, trying not to bolt. When her number appeared, she stood. James rose with her. "I'm right here." She walked to the counter, answered the questions softly at first, then with a little more strength. And when the form was placed in front of her, when the pen was in her hand, her body remembered fear like an old habit. That was when we returned to the moment that almost broke her. The pen hovering, the line waiting. James is quiet beside her, steady enough to hold the world still for one more breath. Diep inhaled, signed her name, and felt something inside her finally unclench. She held the receipt like it was fragile, like it might vanish if she blinked too hard. James leaned close, warmth in his voice like sunlight through bamboo. "You did it." Diep smiled through tears. "I really did." And when they stepped outside, the light felt brighter, like the world hadn't changed at all. But she had. James glanced at her and smiled. "Now," he said. We go get something warm to eat. Diep let out a small laugh, clutching the paper to her chest, and followed him down the street toward the smell of charcoal, sweet corn, and something that felt dangerously like hope. They didn't celebrate with anything fancy. James led Diep down a narrow street near the market where the air always smelled like warm charcoal and sugar, where the light from yellow bulbs made everything look softer than it really was. A small cart sat under a sagging tarp, the metal tray crowded with roasted sweet potatoes, skins darkened, heat trapped inside like a secret. Beside it, corn turned slowly over the coals, kernels glossy and golden. A few steps away, a tiny milk tea stall clinked with ice and plastic cups. Diep slowed the moment she saw it. Her smile came out before she could stop it, small at first, then wider, almost shy. You remembered I like this. James looked at her like the answer was obvious. Of course I remembered. They sat on low plastic stools. Motorbikes passed in a steady rhythm. Vendors called out gently, and laughter floated through the street like a distant song. Smoke curled upward, ribboning through the warm light. James returned with 2 sweet potatoes, 1 corn, and 2 milk teas. He set everything down carefully, as if arranging something precious. Diep wrapped her hands around her cup. Cold plastic, sweet warmth inside. Her fingers drifted to her bag again, touching the receipt through the fabric just to make sure it was still there. James noticed. His voice stayed soft. It won't disappear. Diep swallowed. I know. I just keep thinking I'll wake up and it'll be a dream. James peeled a sweet potato slowly, split it open, and steam rose immediately soft and fragrant. Then eat, he said, handing her half, so you know you're awake. Diep laughed, surprised by how light it sounded. She took a bite and felt her shoulders loosen. It's so warm, she murmured. James bit into the corn, chewing thoughtfully. Good. You've had enough cold days. Her eyes softened, and emotion rushed back so fast it embarrassed her. Today I was supposed to be happy, but happiness for Diep had always been fragile, something she didn't fully trust. I kept telling myself I didn't need school anymore, she admitted quietly. That it was okay to let it go. James didn't interrupt. He let her words land. But every time I saw someone with a backpack, she continued, voice trembling, every time I passed a campus, it felt like I was watching another version of me walk away. James held her gaze, calm certainty in his face. You didn't walk away, he said. You paused because you had to survive. That's not the same thing. Diep blinked hard, throat tightening. After a moment, she whispered, Thank you. James's jaw flexed like gratitude made him uncomfortable. He looked down, focused on peeling the second sweet potato. You don't have to thank me. I do, Diep said gently, firmer now. Because you didn't just stand beside me. You treated my dream like it mattered. James paused. Then he slid the sweet potato toward her. It does matter. Their eyes met. This time, he didn't hide the softness. Diep, he said, low enough that the street couldn't steal it. I'm not here to control your life. I'm here to help you build it. Her throat closed up. She reached across the table and took his hand. James stiffened for a heartbeat. Old instincts, Old caution then relaxed. He let his fingers lace with hers. I want Ly to see me like this, Diep whispered. She will, James answered immediately. I sent her away for the day, Diep admitted, guilt flickering. And I feel bad. You gave her a safe day, James said, and you gave yourself one step forward. Both can be true. Diep breathed out slowly. When I start classes, I'm scared I'll get overwhelmed. Then we plan around it, James said without hesitation. We make it manageable. No perfection, just progress. His voice softened. You're allowed to learn slowly. Diep's lips curved into a steadier smile. You always make me feel lighter. James held her gaze. Because I want you to stay. Not desperate, not demanding, just gentle, certain. Diep squeezed his hand once. I want to. Later, when he stood to pay, he turned back and held out his hand. Diep looked at it, then up at him. His expression was simple, steady. She took his hand and stood. On the ride home, the road darkened, fields stretching wide under a quiet sky. Diep rested her forehead against James's back, arms around him, not tight, not afraid, just close. The bamboo house appeared ahead like a soft shadow with warm light inside, and in Diep's bag, pressed carefully between papers, the receipt lay flat and real. A small thing, a quiet dream. But tonight it felt like the beginning of everything.
Sáng hôm đó tại căn nhà tre, Diệp run rẩy khi mở một hộp tập hồ sơ cũ và đọc lại lời hứa trở lại trường của chính mình. Nhi khi đi vắng cả ngày với một người quen đáng tin cậy nên Diệp có thể tập trung mà không phải lo lắng. Diệp nặng nẽ tiết lộ rằng anh đã chuẩn bị giấy tờ, bút và bản sao mang đến sự trấn an nhẹ nhàng thay vì áp lực. Ở thị trấn, Diệp ngồi ở tòa nhà đăng ký, cố gắng kìm nén sự hoảng loạn ở quầy và cuối cùng ký tên, biến nỗi sợ hãi thành sự nhẹ nhõm. Biên lai trở thành bằng chứng cho thấy những giấc mơ của cô đã thành hiện thực. James và Diệp ăn mừng giản dị gần chợ với khoai lang nướng, ngô và trà sữa dưới ánh đèn vàng ấm áp. Diệp thú nhận rằng cô cảm thấy bị bỏ lại phía sau và sợ bị choáng ngợp. Nhưng James nhìn nhận quá khứ của cô như một sự sống sót chứ không phải thất bại. Nắm tay nhau, James hứa sẽ có những bước đi dễ dàng và sự hỗ trợ, và mong Diệp chờ được kể cho Nhi nghe tin vui.